This is my presentation for understanding the diversity of the European media scene, final assignment. So for this assignment, I decided to compare France and America, and then this presentation will highlight the differences and similarities in the media scene in France and America on the basis of politics, youth culture, war and conflict, the evolution of media technology, and the impact of politics on events in the media. The media scene in 1929 between France and the USA. This period in time was the worst economic collapse in the history of the US and quickly affected the rest of the world. The impact of the economic catastrophe played a significant role in shaping culture, lifestyle, and media outlets around the world. During this time of crisis, media connected the nation together and solidified patriotism and culture in both countries. The Great Depression started on October 28, 1929, with the crash of Wall Street. Shortly afterwards, the after effects of the crisis trickled into Europe and the rest of the globe, putting the entire world into a widespread depressed economic state. During the Great Depression, the U.S. suffered 1/3 of their population being unemployed, roughly 16 million people. Morale was very low, and a new set of values took over the population, creating very frugal and conservative lifestyles. Later on, France finally suffered from the effects of the Great Depression in 1931, a few years after America, despite their strong efforts to avoid the crisis. However, during 1929, France was still recovering from World War I, so a lot of effort was concentrated to recovering from the war and reconstructing damages. France lost a lot of workers to the war, so they opened their borders to allow millions of migrant workers to enter France to allow them to economically rebound. In response to post-war repairs, the government tightly controlled the media to motivate propaganda against Italy and Nazi Germany. So the media scene in 1929 was dominated by print, media, and radio, both in America and France. So because of the increased rate of literacy, a lot of newspapers, magazines, and books were established and published during these years. Because of the constant flow of news, newspaper circulation increased in cities, and journalism became increasingly popular in order for the public to understand the Great Depression. Although newspapers were traditionally the main source of news, they suffered great losses from the Great Depression because with the loss of jobs, advertising revenue decreased 40%, and so a lot of advertisers switched from newspaper to radio, which was a direct impact of the political situation on the media scene. So newspapers started to write to an entire nation instead of communities, and widespread media started during this time. On the other hand, France was experiencing a different media climate. Because of their strong efforts to avoid the Great Depression, their economy didn't struggle right away, so France saw a huge rise in comics, children's books, and magazines and publishings. So in the early 1930s and late 1920s in France, it was the golden age of comics. And during this time, they had 253 daily newspapers in France. So the media scene in 1959. The 1959 into the early 1960s finally showed a post-war era where families started to have more disposable income and can enjoy leisurely activities and enjoy life. It was a time of social movement and civil rights and brought influential change to minorities across the world. The political situation was fairly calmer compared to 1929. France had introduced a new system of governments that became in 1958 called the Fifth Republic, and de Gaulle was also elected as the first president of the Fifth Republic. In some people's eyes, he revitalized France. There was a lot of French progress during this time, and France started to rise up as a big player within Europe. Concurrently, the U.S. was dealing with foreign affairs like Fidel Castro's forces in the Cuban Revolution, and Alaska and Hawaii became U.S. states. During this time, also, there was civil rights movements for Black Americans and Martin Luther King. The media scene in France and the USA was in 1959 was another evolution in the technologies used in media. Televisions became more affordable and accessible and became a staple piece in everyday American homes. By the end of 1959, roughly 52 million Americans owned a television in their house. With the rise of television popularity, game shows and nightly broadcasts rose during this time. In addition to this, pop culture and mass media played a big role in this time period. Young Americans had disposable income for the first time and therefore could indulge in material possessions. Pop culture rose in American youth, like rock and roll, as their love of rebellion against authority, and was the main form of popular entertainment. On the other hand, this was a complicated time for French citizens, as half the population was trying to keep up traditional framework of French culture, while the other was trying to parallel what was happening in the rest of the world. The dominance of American culture at the time played an influential role in the culture in France, and many images of life in America or life were associated with American culture and shown on the media. Regardless, in both countries it was a time of protest, rebellion, idealism, and reflection throughout the youth population, and it directly translated back into the media. And the impact of popular culture in the media, the youth population had a tremendous impact as they were the largest population demographic. Because of their dominance, advertisers and marketers diverted all their attention and advertisements to this age demographic. In America, rock and roll was one of the many forms of expression that embodied their insurrection against authority. The year 1989 was a pivotal moment in global history and shifted many political and national ideologies forever. This year saw many life-altering events such as the Cold War, shaky U.S. presidencies, and it really dismantled the global status quo and marked the end of a post-war era. The political situation in France and USA in 1989 was a critical moment in post-war progress. In the U.S., George Bush and Mikhail Gorbachev met to discuss the end of the Cold War. When this meeting concluded, the end of the Cold War started and the reduction of arms started in both countries. This year also began the presidency of George Bush in America, and along with that, he engaged in a war with Iraq. In French politics, France was closely situated near the action in Germany, and it watched the fall of the Berlin Wall. This event was an incredible transformation for Europe, and Europe started to see a lot of progress in unifying and repairing broken relationships from the war. France also suffered from a recession from 1989 to 1993 and changed the way news was written and distributed. The media scene in 1989 was a lot of political coverage. Within these years, major events happened such as the Berlin Wall, Tiananmen Square protests, slow collapse of the Soviet Union, Moscow's revolution, the emergence of the internet and the World Wide Web, Chinese political uprisings, and a lot more. Contradictory to the 1960s that targeted youth masses and pop media entertainment, 1989 targeted a lot of adult populations and was more informative. At this point in time, the delivery of media had diversified immensely, and now people could receive the news by paper, mail, radio, and television. And France actually was the first country to ever put a newspaper online. The increased usage of cameras and television decreased newspaper readership and brought a blow to the print media industry. Another event that altered the media forever during this time was the internet boom. Although it wasn't common for every household to have the internet, it soon took over the world in the mid-90s. In the late 80s and early 90s, many news channels started to rise up in the world, and this started the era of 24-hour news coverage. The start of the internet boom in America washed the nation in optimism, and the media was a direct reflection of that. Shows like Seinfeld and Frasier symbolize this national optimism, showing happily and financially secure adults. However, behind this curtain of economic prosperity was a truth that the wealth gap was only escalating and getting worse. And the media scene today between France and the USA. In our current culture today, we are constantly flooded with media and information, almost to the point where it's hard to differentiate what is real or fake news. 2020 marks a new era in media and with new channels that were never available before: the internet, social media, YouTube, search browsers, and more. there's more communication and connection worldwide because of advances in technology, and in a way, the world has never been so closely connected. But also, there's more freedom of speech than ever, and tensions continue to rise on this front. As everyone sees now, the political situation across the globe is quite tense. With the outbreak of global pandemic coronavirus, ravishing wildfires, military tension, and many more stories just from this year alone. In U.S. politics, President Donald Trump has attracted a lot of global attention. Trump's aggressive conservative views have impacted the values and ideologies of some extremist groups and has created division between Americans. As for France's political situation, of course, they are also struggling with the coronavirus. However, even with the hyperspeed of information travels today, countries were still unprepared for the arrival of the virus. And France has heavily dealt with the Yellow Vest movement, which started in 2018 to today. As for the media scene in both France and the USA, digital media is a dominant player in the global media distribution. Nearly everyone has access to internet, a cell phone, and likely a television almost everywhere in the world. After a tragedy, the world will likely know within minutes and will have explanation and footage. In times such as this, media can be a great tool used to connect people together and keep the world united. As the globe undergoes a united effort to fight COVID-19, we can all find comfort knowing that our friends and family are just at our fingertips and that we can still remain socially connected thanks to the media. As for media in France, 51% of the print and online media is controlled by companies in the financial and insurance sectors. The influence of the national political situation has a critical role in what we see every day. In America, President Donald Trump has used media to gain attention to his campaigns and his opinions. Media is a great tool that can be used to gain social justice, but can also be a dangerous weapon in the wrong hands. As many people can agree, social media is being used for the wrong context for Donald Trump, and many of the things that he shares with the world cause civil unrest. In America, the media has direct impact on politics. Just recently, a black man was deliberately killed by a police officer as an act out of racism, and with it being caught on camera. Now, for 3 days straight, protests have been raging across the state of Minneapolis and the U.S., and without these media outlets, social justice might not have been served. In response to the coronavirus outbreak, 2020 has seen an increased usership of desktop internet usage because workforces and schools have made a quick switch online. So it goes to show how much of an impact the current situation has on the usership of every kind of media. As you can maybe see from this report and presentation, a large portion of the information that I could find was actually about American politics and history. I think it goes to show how filtered the media is and how much power and control our media outlets have on withholding and sharing information. For example, I'm from Canada, and at the time of the Brexit, there were only a few headlines about the separation of England from the EU. Meanwhile, a majority of my headlines that I was seeing every day were about irrelevant American politics and Donald Trump's next statement. This is frustrating for people who want to become more aware of global issues. In this day and age, more than ever, we need transparent news outlets and courageous journalists to share the news that matters to the world. Politics play an impactful role on shaping the media, as seen through history, and were a pivotal factor in the technological developments of media. During historical events, media was there to inform the world. In times of loneliness, media connected us together. Whether it was on paper, television, radio, or smartphone, for children or for adults, it was the one constant that connected the world together. The media is an extremely powerful source and will play a role in our lives forever. So with so much power, we need to remain vigilant and observant to what news and media we intake.